So some of this may seem brand new. Some of this may seem redundant and old. One of the difficulties in trying to pitch a talk about ethics in an interdisciplinary group is that most disciplines come at ethics at least a little bit differently. So I'm going to start with some pretty basic stuff. The goal here is to kind of try to provide a foundation for thinking about ethics in relation to human augmentics, and to provide some background to how ethics and the law, because you can't really escape that anytime you talk about ethics in the field of health and medicine, how these provide a kind of framework for our thinking about the sorts of things we might undertake or even think about in relation to augmentics. I was tempted to put, to call this talk something like, it's complicated. And that just seemed like too much of an understatement. Because a lot of ethics is tied up with culture and with our upbringing, our background, with the social circles in which we move, with institutions in which we're brought up and in which we participate. And I do, I can, because I do take up entire semesters with discussion of philosophy and ethics, as Andrea at least will attest, because she's in a philosophy of technology course with me this semester. It can get really complicated the more you delve into the philosophy of it, and I've tried to keep it as simple as I can, but stop me if you have questions or issues or concerns or things don't make sense, or if they seem wrong. Because one of the interesting things, of course, about ethics is that there are no necessary right or wrong answers. There's a lot of discussion, there's a lot of debate, and there are a lot of positions we can take. But at the end of the day, a lot of what we end up doing is engaging in dialogue about what we perceive to be right and wrong. So what is ethics? It's a set of moral principles and guidelines for behavior that guide our actions with other people within society. It just, doesn't that seem easy? I mean, that's so nice, right? I mean, even, not only does it seem like a simple definition, it just seems nice, right? It should guide our action, Unfortunately, because it involves morality, it involves what people think is right and wrong, or good or bad, which inherently makes it dialogic and complicated, because we have different ideas about what right and wrong are in particular circumstances. So what ethics is, I think, for our purposes, and for anybody who studies ethics, is a critical reflection on morality, right? Not simply saying, well, I think this is right and I think this is right, but why is something wrong or right? What's the underlying reason for a particular moral stance? Here's an example of one, in fact.
I want us to say something. What should I say? Make something up. Be excellent to each other.
And they are rightfully amazed.
Party on, dudes!
Right, as an ethical stance, be excellent to each other is pretty good, actually. We could spend the next hour or so kind of discussing what it means to be excellent to each other, but you can actually glean a lot from Bill and Ted, which might be a surprise to Keanu Reeves and the unknown actor who's fallen off the face of the earth, right? I mean, how sad. You can make jokes about Keanu, but this other guy, I just feel bad for him.
Should have said party on, dude. That would have changed it.
It's an interesting point, isn't it? So how does law enter into this, right? Because there are legal issues involved. We'll get to some more of those toward the end of what I'm talking about. But basically, law differs, right, from ethics. I mean, they're intertwined potentially. But law requires you to do things. Right? The law says you must do X. Ethics, you might feel ethically required to do something. But the law literally says this is what you must do. And laws are usually derived, in no small part, from ethical conflicts or dilemmas. And those, in an effort to codify and make, in some cases, ethical decisions simpler and to avoid some of the conflict and tension that ethical dilemmas might bring, we create laws. I particularly want to focus on ethics this morning and not so much on law. Not only because I'm not a lawyer and I don't play one in the classroom, but because I think ethics is actually much more interesting. Right? Because it is something that's dialogic in a way that law isn't really. I mean, we can debate and discuss law, but at the end of the day, we have to do what the law says. Bioethics is a particularly interesting area of ethics, and I'm not going to delve into it sort of as directly this morning because I want us to have that sort of foundation of understanding of ethics. But the reason I think it's particularly interesting is because modern medicine, right, and research have gone well beyond what basic ethical debates have brought, the point to which they brought us at this time. The speed with which technology and biology are merging, as hopefully you've seen throughout the course of the 9 or 10 weeks or while we've been here, tends to give us some things to think about that ethicists have really only recently begun thinking about, that science fiction writers have probably been thinking about more than ethicists have, at least for about the last 40 or 50 years. All of these things are related. The major difference that I want to get to is that bioethics pushes the boundaries of ethics because it's particularly personal and because it involves the human body. And there's something very specific and very unique about ethical discussions that involve bodies, not just humans, right? But bodies. I've already mentioned that. So ethical dilemmas occur when they're competing interests, basically, when there has to be a decision or a choice between a couple of competing alternatives. In many cases, that's not necessarily simply between good and bad. That could also be between good and good, or bad and bad, and making a decision, right, about which one is gooder or badder than the other, right? So, for example, should parents have a right to refuse immunizations for a child? Right? How many? Just out of curiosity, right? How many think parents should have that right? Okay. And how many don't have an opinion? And how many think parents should not have the right to refuse an immunization? See, this is an ethical dilemma, right? We could probably spend the next hour, we could do the whole sort of debate kind of thing, and take sides, take positions. And there's a case to be made on all sides, and I'll get into some of the positions along which, kind of the lines along which you might be able to make some of those cases. Does public safety supersede an individual's right? Should children with serious birth defects be kept alive? Who gets the organs for transplant? Who should be first in line for augmentation?
That's an obvious
Us. Nice, Jason. Nice. Sorry. Ethical dilemma solved. We need to model ethical behavior. Some of this stuff will break your heart. These are not easy decisions. And some of you may have had some experience with these sorts of things already, either yourselves directly, with family, with friends, right? You know, questions like who should be first in line for an organ transplant? Not only is that not an easy decision, but it is a draining decision. It is an emotionally difficult decision. Should we treat people with augmentation different in some circumstances? I mean, I'm really not holding up my end of presentations here because I've only shown you one video so far, and I think there's been an average of like one video for every 3 slides in everything we've seen to this point. So, you know, I'm sort of, you know, on that line of getting drummed out of a visualization lab for not showing enough video. And I could show you a video here. You know, the I think he's a Brazilian runner, right, who wants to compete in the Olympics, but he's double amputee. Should he be allowed to run, you know, with non-augmented runners? You might remember the Hugh Herd talk that we saw, right, where he basically says, you know, I actually see myself as having an advantage having these prosthetic legs. And his goal is to get rid of disability altogether through augmented. But what does that mean? What would disability mean if basically we said we can do legs better, so everybody's going to get augmented legs, but aren't we still going to have like some variation in legs? So is that really doing away with disability? There's a variety of theories, basically, that have developed over the centuries that have guided people who thought about ethics, and these are sort of the basic ones. Deontology or deontological ethics is a primary one, which basically says that some acts are right or wrong independent of their consequences. Rightness is what matters the most. We have a duty to do the right thing. This is in contrast to teleological ethics or consequentialism. Okay? That the consequences of one action determine whether an action is right or wrong. Okay? So instead of having an absolute, does the end justify the means? What are the consequences of what we're going to do? Another viewpoint is virtue ethics or intuition. It's the character of the individual making the decision that matters the most. Are you at heart a good person, and therefore making the right decision? And then, particularly in Western culture, and even more particularly in the U.S., right? There's something we call rights ethics, that everybody has rights, and those rights must be respected. Codified, right? The right to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Those must be respected. And then there's pragmatic ethics, that ethical norms emerge from a continual process of inquiry and observation, that ethics are not fixed, but that they occur through dialogue, through science, right, through scientific method, and through discussion and debate. And then finally, well, not quite finally, but utilitarian ethics, which, right, you might be familiar with. I mean, you know, I'm sure Jason is, right, from Star Trek. Right? The greatest good for the greatest number of people. Right? A very Vulcan concept. So some, you know, quick examples. Deontology. A doctor believes she has a duty to give cardiac patients detailed information about the condition, even though the patient has indicated they're not ready or maybe terrified to get that information. If your belief system is rooted in deontological ethics, you give that information. You move the patient right, because it's your duty as a doctor to clearly give all the information you have. Even if your patient is sitting in the office squirming and going, I don't really want to know this. This isn't. On the other hand, if you're a consequentialist, the doctor would give only information which would have been of benefit to the patient. So the motivation here is beneficence, right? Doing something good for the patient, thinking through the consequences of giving that information. Would giving that information actually result in some good, in some greater understanding, change in behavior perhaps, and so from a deontological perspective, this is a betrayal. You're not doing your job because you're actually holding back some information, or you're couching information in a way that maybe makes it less clear or tries to sugarcoat it, or what have you. But the question in both cases really is, who assigns responsibility or duty? Like who says? Right? And for the most part, at least in the West, that assignment comes from the individual. Although, it's never that simple. Because our belief system, where we, if we look at this in a very sort of binary way and say that, deontology, teleology, ends of the spectrum, where we are in that spectrum depends on a variety of things, not the least of which is our training. People we've worked with, perhaps been influenced by, perhaps our parents and our family, and then perhaps the institution in which we work. Right? What if this doctor works in a hospital, and hospital policy is, here's how we do it. We give patients all the information in all cases, no matter what, and that's what you have to do. But what if that's in conflict with your position, which is more on the other side of things, that you're going to provide information only to the degree that a patient seems comfortable with it, right? So there's a lot of competition here, right? There's a lot of tension potentially between what your position might be, how you determine what you're going to do. And for the most part, these sort of decisions are made incredibly quickly. Like they're made on the fly. In some cases, they're made in the moment. Right? If this doctor is giving the patient information and starts to notice a degree of discomfort, you might start to change the presentation, or you may not, depending on your ethical stance. But my point is that this is happening, sort of in real time. This is not, the kind of thing where you can sort of sit back and go, well, let me see, if I was a consequentialist, this is what I would tell this person. And the patient's sort of sitting there going, so do I got cancer or no? There are two basic questions here when it comes to these sort of dilemmas. What should I do? And why should I do it? And these are incredibly simple questions that are incredibly hard to answer. Someday, maybe I should think about giving these to a doctoral student for approval, because it doesn't get much harder than this. The question, and a lot of this is tied up, as I've already said, in a variety of ways, to one's identity, to who we feel we are, which is tied with race, culture, ethnicity, our own personal histories, and the intersection of those histories with racial history, ethnic history, cultural history. We are not, atomized individuals here operating in a vacuum. And this further complicates things for us. Our sense of morality develops over a very long period of time and continues to develop as we go. And some of the conflict we may feel may arise from our very own sense of perhaps betraying some of the ethics and morality with which we've grown up. But we need to keep in mind that this operates not only in our case, right, but in the case of people with whom we may interact. In other words, so far I've probably been talking more in terms of our ethics. But ethics is not something that we impose on others. So as we do things like design interfaces, devices, hardware, software, we need to keep in mind too that there are others who will interact with what we do who will have ethical positions themselves. And we need to at least try to think about what that means. Now, we'll probably go crazy if we try to think about what that means in all circumstances for all people at all times. But it needs to be part of our thinking as designers, as engineers, as writers, as artists, and so on. Because that's the only way for us to avoid conflict that's inevitably going to arise anyway. It's never purely avoidable. And we deal with these sorts of misunderstandings and conflicts at all times. But we can avoid, I think, some of them, or at least ameliorate them, if we try to keep in mind that our ethics are not necessarily the only ones out there in the world. So most of our principles relating particularly to bioethics and I think augmentation derive to some degree from the principle of autonomy, that everybody needs to have a degree of control over their own bodies, that they are the final arbiter. Now, that runs into some ethical issues too, which I'll get to in a little bit. But particularly in the West, particularly in the US, this notion of autonomy has been kind of rooted for about the last 250 years in various legal principles. And most of our debate in recent years about the principle of autonomy when it comes to human bodies has actually been one that people have sought to codify in law. So we have, and unless you've been doing nothing but spending time in this lab in front of a screen working on your project, you can't miss these sort of debates that have to do with various issues surrounding abortion, contraception, and so on. Who controls, who has some say over what happens to a body? This continues to be an enormous debate in society at the moment. We can say that it's a principle, right? Autonomy and freedom is a principle here, an ethical principle. But if you just think about it a little bit, think about how difficult of a principle it is to uphold on a personal level. Even in a very simple case, say getting glasses or contacts, right? We usually ask other people's opinions, even if it's something as mundane as, what do these glasses look like, or how do you think I would look without glasses? We're always sort of gauging opinion. Even though we have autonomy and freedom, we're still within a social setting, be it family or friends or just the general public, in which even though we may act independently, our independent actions are ones that we still envision in the presence of others. Another ethical principle along these lines is veracity, right? That we should be telling the truth, we should be honest. This is probably the easiest one to grasp. Privacy and confidentiality. An easy one to grasp, but not necessarily an easy one to maintain, particularly when it comes to dealing with information once it's digitized. Do good, be excellent to each other. Do no harm, put the patient first, right? Beneficence is an important principle. And for those of you who, well, I shouldn't say those of you who, right? Everybody went through the IRB certification, right? This is a huge, huge principle. This matters a lot, right? And similarly, right, the principle that we should do no harm, it's a cornerstone of ethical behavior and research. Fidelity. If you tell somebody that you're going to do something, You need to stick to what he tells you. It's staying true to your promise. And then justice. Right? Fairness, equity, equality. And there are two sort of basic concepts of justice. Comparative justice, right, where you make a decision based on criteria and outcomes. So when that one kidney is available, who gets it, right? A 55-year-old male with 3 children, or 13, well, it should be 13-year-old girl. You make a comparison between these two cases, or there could be non-comparative justice. Flip a coin. The winner gets the kidney. It's fair, right? Right? Is everybody comfortable with flip a coin for a kidney? It's fair. Communication is critical in all of these situations, right? Because ethics only occurs, right, in dialogue. And in some cases, that dialogue is internal. Right? It's us talking to ourselves about what we should do, how we should do it, why we should do it, and so on. But it's only through communication that we can determine ethical behavior with others. Because that's how we determine things about who has power in a given situation, what effects there might be on self-esteem, what somebody's personality is, education level, all of these things. And we determine these, too, very much on the fly, right? As we're engaging with people, as we're making sense of a particular situation, of what we're being told. Here's an example where communication is critical. This was from a pamphlet that was supposed to show, or not supposed to, but shows the best way to treat diabetics' feet in Ethiopia. Right? So you see a picture there of somebody having their feet washed, keeping clean, and trying to avoid infection and so on, and ultimately avoid amputation. Are there any potential ethical issues that you can see from this presentation?
Assumes access to clean water.
It assumes access to clean water, to tap water, right, because it's coming from a faucet there, which may not always be the case. Any other issues you might?
It assumes that water can be expended in cleaning yourself instead of drinking to stay alive.
Okay. It assumes a particular use for water. Who does it look like, who's doing the washing and who's getting washed? Yeah. So, some of the people who saw this were offended by it because they felt that it upheld the traditional gender stereotype, that it should be women washing men's feet. And it reinforces a cultural norm that people were trying to erase at around this time that this pamphlet was drawn up. So it was an effective pamphlet in the sense of showing what steps to take and trying to encourage people to do this. It was also culturally somewhat insensitive because people were offended that it shows a woman washing a man's feet. Another example, I don't know if you can read, the text there says more women died of lung cancer in the year 2000 than of breast, uterine, and ovarian cancer combined. You'll see a lot of this sort of thing in health advertising. It's a way to try to get somebody's attention, right? But it's also problematic, right? I couldn't find. I remember seeing an ad for it was like an AIDS prevention type of thing, and it showed a picture of two women standing side by side from the waist below, right? And one woman looked like she must have been relatively elderly, long kind of wool skirt, socks, kind of big blocky shoes. And the woman standing next to her, right, had short shorts, like sandals, and then the text was something like, AIDS can strike anyone. And there are issues here, right? This is not. And so when we're designing things, or when we're thinking about, here's the text that we need to put in here, how can this be interpreted? Right, is an important question to ask. What are the potential interpretations? Is somebody going to look at this in a way that might be unintended? And are there potential unintended adverse effects? So, consequentialism would say you need to think through what those consequences might be. Deontology would say, doesn't matter. Is this effective? Is this the right thing to do? Right. So there's a variety of positions you can take on these things. The point is, though, that whatever the case, it's worth thinking through what those positions and stances might be. In some cases, you don't get that choice. Right? So the Patient Self-Determination Act, for instance, in the medical field, right, you're not supposed to be making decisions for someone else. Right? Patients are supposed to have that right for them. They can't make the wrong decision. And that's a dilemma. But on the other hand, right, one of the things you're supposed to avoid, right, is undue influence. So, this is, I kept thinking about this in terms of the colonoscopy group. Right? How do you prevent crossing a line here potentially? Similarly, HIPAA, right? You're supposed to. You're not supposed to. That's a ridiculous way to put it. You have to. Right? Ensure privacy and confidentiality. There are no questions here. No dilemmas. And yet, every time I go to the doctor's office, right, and I go up to the counter, and everybody's records are strewn all over the front counter, I kind of go, really? In research, in the kinds of things that we've been discussing in the semester so far, these sorts of moral conflicts are inevitable. For a variety of reasons. I mean, one is that all of this stuff is really pretty brand new. Another reason is that the resources for it are pretty scarce. Another reason is that when you're doing research, you're thinking about things differently. Some of what you're doing is purely imaginary work. Right? You're imagining what might be. Now, I think it's great to be able to imagine that in regard to what we might do as technologists. But we need to think beyond what we can do as technologists and think about what the consequences might be of what we do. And we also have to live with the fact that we cannot possibly predict the consequences in all cases. There are always going to be unintended ones. Emil Berliner never thought, I expect, that people would be using record players, right, for scratching in the way that hip-hop artists use it. It's an unintended consequence. Digital sampling of music, probably not what the folks at Sony were thinking as they were developing CD players. or that an artist like Oval would take scratched up CDs and use those to make music. Lots of unintended consequences. We can think of unintended consequences forever. So we can't possibly think through all of them. But we would be horribly remiss if we didn't think through at least some. Now, one reason it's important to think through some of them is because it helps us think about how we think about this stuff. It helps us think about our metaphors. How we, what's our mindset? What's our frame of reference? Do we think of, one of the interesting things about watching, some of the TED Med talks, for instance, is that there's a lot of the metaphors about how people are broken and we can repair them. It's the sort of $6 million man. We can fix him. We can make him better. On one level, I don't doubt that's true. On another level, I kind of wonder if we need to think about, about repair in this sense. What does it mean to be sick? Does it mean that you're broken? That you can be repaired? There's also, and I always find this a little bit sort of odd and somewhat comical and ironic. I mean, it seems like every time I've had some interaction with a hospital in the last few years, a couple weeks later I get a phone call from somebody who does a customer satisfaction survey. I was a little bit puzzled by this. I said, well, did you have a good experience at our hospital? What do you mean? You have a nice cafeteria. I think the surgical thread you used was pretty good. What are you talking? And this kind of sometimes goes off the rails, right? I mean, I know of at least one circumstance where somebody, basically, a family member died. The hospital called a couple weeks later and said, "So, how was your experience at our hospital?" Well, shitty. Right? It was really bad, right? Somebody died. So this, so there's some issues here about how we think about health and medicine and technology. Right? I mean, if you're doing a follow-up on the device that you develop or the software you develop in this class, how would you define customer satisfaction? And how would you even ask about it in some cases? I'm going to pick on the colonoscopy group again, just because colonoscopies are just so easy to pick on. Did you have a good colonoscopy? You need to think about what, that's just a crude example, but in keeping with ethics here, I'll potentially cross a line.
Meet Agnes, the MIT Age Lab's Age Gain Now Empathy System. This suit was designed to provide insight into the physical effects of aging. The various components stimulate the changes that occur naturally as we age. Put on this suit and you feel increased fatigue, reduced flexibility in joints and muscles, spinal compression, and difficulty with vision and balance. Altogether, Agnes is more than just a suit. It is a calibrated method developed and constructed by exercise physiologists, engineers, and designers. As demographics shift, we need to fully understand the needs of an aging population to design a future that is accessible and engaging for people of every age. Agnes is a better way to see how a product, service, or environment is used and navigated by an older adult, because it allows us to experience it for ourselves. Agnes is one tool that we use at the Age Lab to study and improve life tomorrow.
I don't need the suit. I wake up this way every morning. But this is one way to arrive at some understanding of, right, and have some empathy with, right, other people. This is literally not just putting yourself in their shoes. It's putting yourself. I mean, this is an interesting sort of version of augmentation. It's future me in fabric, in a sense, right? I mean, you get to feel what it's like, and it's really useful because it literally helps you right? Achieve some degree of empathy. If you're designing a kind of technology that might be targeted toward people as they age, you can't, I think, achieve a good degree of empathy without communication. In this case, it's a very direct sort of experience. But you could possibly achieve something close to this simply by talking with other people, garnering, gathering experiences. But without doing that, I think it's incredibly hard to think about how we might, how others might encounter the things that we develop and design as we work on augmentation. It's one thing to sort of think about, I give Jason a hard time about this one, sort of the whole future me concept, because it just, the abbreviation of it as FME is, potentially unfortunate in some ways. But if we're going to think about, what we might become in the future, we can think about what others might become in the future too, and how they may benefit or not from the things that we're designing. One decision model that I've seen used in a variety of medical settings is this one, right? It's very basic. I mean, this really ought not require too much effort to explain, right? It shows a circular process, right, of assessing, diagnosing, planning, implementing, evaluating, and then ongoing. Now, this gives you no insight per se into ethics, except that it ought to show you that ethical decisions are part of the entire circle. Right? It's part of the whole process. Your ethical stance determines what you do at all of these points. And your ethical stance may vary depending on what point you're at in that circle. But yeah, in closing, I want to get Father in here in just a second, kind of run a bit over. Yep. Our fiction is a lot better than our truth when it comes to thinking about things. It's really useful to read science fiction, to look at what people have thought possible futures might be, and think about whether or not those might be consequences. Not as a means toward action ourselves, but as a means of broadening our thinking about what might come in the future, and how we might have a role to play in it. Because we can have that sort of role. That's one of the really, I think, one of the really fascinating things about this course, about this effort, at EVL in particular, is that it gives us an opportunity to have a hand in the development of some particularly interesting futures, but not ones that we just sort of willy-nilly develop without anything else before we move on? Thus endeth ethics, right? You're done. Just kidding.